Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, wherever you're based. And thank you so much for joining today uh, for the second edition of the Transparency series, where we will be talking about the role of civil society in ensuring pharmaceutical transparency. This webinar is co-organized together with Health Justice Initiative and Colombia's National University's think tank, Medicines, Information and Power. And it will be moderated by my colleague, Jaime Manzan. The Transparency series is a series of webinars organized by Salud for Derecho, where we try to look at the different aspects related to pharmaceutical transparency. This is the second series, as I said, the second webinar, as I said, and we're expecting to announce a few new series in the future on clinical trial transparency and the EU Transparency Directive in the coming months. Stay tuned for more. Today's webinar, as I said, we will be presenting some case studies of how civil society have contributed to expand transparency in the pharmaceutical sector through strategic litigation specifically. We are very happy to have Fatima Hassan to tell us about the experience of Health Justice Initiative during the COVID-19 pandemic. Fatima is the founder and director of Health Justice Initiative. She's a human rights lawyer and a social justice activist. She's been working her entire life defending and promoting the human right to health in South Africa. She holds a BA and an LLB from University of the Witwatersrand and an LLM from Duke University. She has experience working at South Africa's Constitutional Court and as a ministerial advisor, and she headed the OSEP office in South Africa for several years. We are also fortunate to have Professor Claudia Patricia Vaca González. She is a fellow pharmacist. I'm always happy to count with more pharmacists in the community. And she's also an associate professor at the National University of Colombia. She specializes in pharmacoepidemiology, and she has served as an advisor to the Ministry of Health in Colombia. She's the founder of the think tank on Medicines, Information and Power, and she's been recently appointed as Deputy Ombudsperson for the right to health and social security in Colombia. Together with José Daniel Rengifo, also member of the think tank Medicines, Information and Power. Both the three people will explain their experiences expanding transparency in their respective countries before Q&A, where we will open the floor for questions. If you want to pose any questions, please use the Q&A function and we will address them at the end of the presentation. Before jumping to the case studies, I would like to explain a bit where this collaboration emerged and set the scene a bit before starting. So the work that will be presented today is part of a hopefully forthcoming book chapter called Formulating and Implementing Pharmaceutical Pricing Policies. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge and thank the work and time of Jaime Manzano and Lili Molina from Salud por Derecho, Claudia Vaca, José Daniel Rengifo from CPMIP, Fatima Hassan from Health Justice Initiative, and Juan Luis Beltrán from the Spanish Society of Public Health and Health Management for their work and time in making this book chapter possible. The objective of the chapter was basically to highlight and document the role of civil societies in challenging opacity in the pharmaceutical sector, identify common barriers and enabling factors, portray transparency as a democratic and global health, as a democratic right and global health issue, analyze power dynamics in the pharmaceutical sector, and provide some insights to other civil society organizations to take action in this field in the coming years. As you all know, secrecy is one of the defining factors of the pharmaceutical sector, from the R&D to commercialization and supply, and secrecy covers the entire value chain of a drug. Today, we will focus on the part related to price transparency, specifically net price transparency. And I usually like to start on this topic to say that basically when publicly shared information on medicine prices can be accessed by everyone without being depleted through use, which basically means that price information is a global public good. Everyone benefits from using it without depleting it. And so this basically would allow purchasers to negotiate prices with full access to the information of how other purchasers set their prices, enabling a more transparent and accountable mechanism of price setting globally. However, most purchasers, including countries, global health institutions, and even some NGOs, have systematically embraced the signature of non-disclosure agreements, which impede access to this information. When purchasers sign NDA agreements, basically they are creating barriers to the work that they are doing themselves, especially through the increased discrepancies between the list and the prices, so the prices that are made public more often and those that are kept secret, which basically makes companies to file for registration and commercialization on their drugs in those countries that have higher list prices and skewing the reference prices for other countries, which basically creates unaffordable and inaccessible treatments globally. This is why we say from Salud for Derecho and from many other organizations that price transparency is obviously a national issue, but it's a global health issue. There is another aspect to this, which is the lack of accountability and the impact on public trust when basically civil society and the public cannot access how much money governments are in public health systems are spending on the drugs that we are buying. So basically a two-sided issue, democratic issue, an accountability issue, and a global health issue. When we look at it from the government's perspective, and I'm going to be using here a reference from Julia Frank and Suri Moon, civil society and the emergence and proliferation of other non-state actors has been a key defining feature of the global health governance system. And this is exemplified during the HIV crisis in the 90s, the attempts to reduce the price of cancer drugs in the early 2000s, of the hepatitis C therapies in the 2010s, or during the COVID-19 pandemic. And civil society has been supporting and playing an essential role in ensuring that the global health system meet the four functions as described by these two authors. The first one is stewardship, and the second one, mobilization of global solidarity. As accountability watchdog, civil society has been raising public awareness and advocating for health across sectors, acting as stewards of the system's performance. By raising public awareness, acting as experts in policy-making processes, and in some cases through leveraging their sort of moral power, these networks of civil society have been able to raise global solidarity and cooperation. But also by advocating for greater transparency and more equitable access to medicine, civil society work to ensure the provision of global public goods, which is another function of the system, and mitigating the negative externalities of the current system. Basically, instruments like the core, the clinical trial cost reporting toolkit, the work in measuring medicines prices, work on clinical trial transparency, and many other tools that have been made public in the last couple of decades. Civil society have been an essential tool to make medicine information a global public good. And this is why we're here today, to listen to the experiences of two very relevant organizations in making public information, medicine information global public good. And without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Fatima Hassan, so she can explain to us her experience in South Africa. Thank you, Fatima.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me on the panel. Adrián, I was wondering if you could share the screen with the 3 slides, please, for me. Thank you.
Yes. Let me see. You should be able to see it now.
There we go. Yeah, perfect. There's only 3 slides, so if you don't mind, I'll ask you to do the sequencing for me. So I have about 7 minutes, and I just wanted to share with you in a very summary form the experience of South Africa in trying to open up the COVID vaccine contracts, which basically is, the subject of the chapter and also the webinar, and the reasons why we did the case as the Health Justice Initiative and also what we found. But first, I just wanted to give you some preliminary sort of remarks. The first is that during 2020 and 2021, the context of what was happening in our country and in our continent and in our region is very important, because obviously you don't turn to the courts to try and open up contracts if there isn't a very specific political context for what is happening in our country. So there were three major reasons and issues about why we felt that it was not okay to be in a country where public resources were being used to purchase very expensive vaccines from multiple suppliers, but where the contracts were secret. The first is that we were experiencing a situation of quite gross vaccine apartheid. It's also been referred to as a moral and grotesque failure by the WHO and by many others. Many academics have written about this. You all know, if you came from the Global South, you basically waited longer than most people in the Global North to be able to access your first dose of a vaccine. So it was a context of vaccine apartheid, where pharmaceutical companies were calling all the shots. They have unfettered power, but they had asked us as South Africans to participate in 4 clinical trials for Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, and there was a 4th one. But we weren't prioritized for early access. So we contributed to the research and development of these vaccines on an accelerated basis in 2020, 2021, but we weren't in the front of the line. And basically that was a situation reminiscent of what happened in the late 90s and early 2000s, when people in South Africa and the rest of Africa and Latin America were told that your lives were not important enough and you would have to wait for antiretrovirals for HIV. So that's particular context of why people were really angry. The contracts, we were told, were subject to non-disclosure agreements and to high levels of secrecy. It was the vaccine apartheid, the no access. And then the third reason or the context is that we actually live in a country with a democracy. And that means that our procurement using public resources are governed by principles on public procurement that are included in our constitution. So the leverage that we had was a constitution which could not be surpassed or which could not be trumped by the demands of a pharmaceutical company or industry in the long term. They did trample on our constitution in the initial period, but over time we were able to open up the contracts and show that the principles of our constitution are paramount. So if we get the next slide, and we've just provided the link for you, and you can access all the contracts, all the analysis, everything from that. So what we did was HAI was formed in the middle of 2020, and quite soon into sort of doing this work around trying to address issues of vaccine apartheid and inequity in access, having learned from the lessons of HIV, we felt, like I've said earlier, that it was totally scandalous to have a situation where you had 4 vaccine suppliers who were multinational pharmaceutical companies who had a history of procuring with the South African government, to one say that they would only procure with the state because they wanted total indemnification. And that's similar to what happened in most of Latin America and other parts of the Global South. But secondly, to insist that when they negotiated or when they procured with the national government, they wouldn't allow any kind of procurement through any other means. So there was no private procurement taking place, that they would only supply vaccines to South Africa if the government agreed to a non-disclosure agreement and if the contracts were a secret. And like I've said, there's certain constitutional principles in South Africa that even the public interest of trying to respond to a pandemic does not trump the right to have information about what's contained in the contracts, including just even basic information about what the price is. So what we did was we timed our case, and I think timing is important, Adrián, because we didn't want to go to court in 2021 or immediately where there was a possibility that our litigation could jeopardize the procurement of vaccines because our country needed the vaccines. That would have created a backlash where the public would have said, through your legal action, you're actually delaying the arrival of vaccines in South Africa. So we waited for a substantial amount of vaccines to actually come into the country. It was on a drip feed basis. It came in on a month by week basis. It certainly wasn't accelerated. We all had to wait for the first shot, second shot. And once there was a substantial amount of vaccines in, we then used our access to information laws in South Africa, which is the other advantage we have, in addition to this broad constitutional framework for public transparency and for information sharing. And we submitted information requests to our government. Now, this is important because our access to information laws in South Africa allow you to ask for information of government, even where it enters into a contract with a third party. So we wouldn't be able to submit an access to information application directly to Pfizer or to Moderna or to AstraZeneca or to Johnson & Johnson, but you can get in through the back door and actually request the information from our government. So initially, the response was that we are suing our government, that we are fighting with our government, that we are taking our government on. So that's partly true. But the strategy was that in order to be able to access the records of private pharmaceutical companies, we had to use our government in a sense and the laws available to us to try and access this information. It could have not worked. The strategy could have backfired. We could have won in the public opinion, but we could have lost in the courts because government was entitled to say that if we release the information, it wouldn't be in the public interest. If we release the information, it's going to jeopardize our vaccine access or vaccine negotiations, or this is a state secret, or that it's subject to the confidentiality clauses, all arguments that they did raise. But I'll talk shortly about how we were able to get around that. So what's important is that we sued our government, not the pharmaceutical companies. And the second thing we did was, before we filed our legal papers, and we launched this in 2022 because our government refused to give us the information under South Africa's information laws. If the party that you're asking for the information refuses to give it to you and you believe a constitutional right is being infringed, you can actually approach the High Court and ask them to make a determination where they would order the relevant government department to make those records available, which is what happened in our case. But what we did before we launched legal proceedings, and I think this is also important for how you deal with the litigious nature of the pharmaceutical industry itself, is we wrote to each of the pharmaceutical companies and said, we would like to have access to the contracts based on the following legal arguments, and we are filing legal papers, and in order for you to know what's in our legal papers, we would like to know which office should we serve these papers on, just so that you have this available to you. And in other words, what is your legal service address and which company, which part of the subsidiary, because, you know, part of the design of the global pharmaceutical industry is to make it so messy that you never know who exactly you're suing, so that the company can eventually say that you've sued the wrong subsidiary or you've sued the wrong company. And all of them responded by saying, even that information is confidential. Even the service address is confidential. Even which company you should be actually serving your legal papers on is confidential. And that was an important, I think, strategy and trick, because what we then did was we went to court, we filed our papers, and we said the onus is now on government to join these pharmaceutical companies if it feels their interests are at stake. Because we don't know which companies you've actually signed contracts with legally, and we don't know what the service address is. We've asked them and they're refusing to give us the information. And it created quite a scandal in South Africa that Pfizer said even this information is confidential. People were really angry. They were waiting for vaccines. They wanted to know who we signing contracts with, and why can't we know what the service address is even. So surprisingly, we didn't think that the case would actually get to court quite soon, but within a few months, we actually got a hearing date. The case was argued. Government did raise the issue that they signed a confidentiality clause, they signed an NDA, that they argued that we should have sued the pharmaceutical companies or at least joined them. They wanted the case deferred. And surprisingly, the court very quickly, it was a single judge, by August already, I think we argued the case in June, by August already, the court actually ruled in our favor. And if you read the judgment, which is on our website, it's a very angry court. It's saying we were subject to lockdown, we were subject to socioeconomic losses because of the pandemic, we waited for vaccine, we were subject to vaccine abandonment. How can you come to court and say this contract is secret or that it's confidential when you're using public resources? And you're looking at close to, I think it was about R1 billion, which is a significant amount of money in a country that is a very high level of unemployment to buy these vaccines. So this is not, small change. It's not money that came from some rich philanthropist. It came from the public purse. And what we found then in the contracts and the multi-stakeholder analysis of all the contracts, we within a few days made it available on our website and we shared it with the public, because the idea of the litigation was that it's not just for our benefit. It's for everybody in South Africa to read the contracts. It's for everybody in the region. It's for everybody else in other parts of the world. And you remember at that time, Adrián, that there was a few attempts around the world to try and access the contracts, but most people were getting redacted versions. And secondly, in some cases, in some countries, they were being told, no, they can't access the contract. So it was a world first globally that a court had ordered the disclosure of the contracts in an unredacted form within 10 days with a cost order. So the unredacted version, I think, is really critical and important. Those are the versions we put up on our website. And what we did was, in order to protect, and I think this is important for civil society, to protect us from litigation from the pharmaceutical companies, because remember, the court made this order in their absence without them actually being part of the case. And I think that's significant. But in order to protect ourselves from accusations of bias or that we had a particular view about these contracts, and also to protect ourselves from any kind of nefarious litigation from the pharmaceutical industry itself, we decided to establish a multi-stakeholder analysis group, which is made up of different access to medicine, research, legal people, lawyers, contract experts from around the world. So that one of the criticisms that we potentially could face about bias could be dealt with the fact that we've actually assembled a multidisciplinary team that has carefully looked at every single contract. We did it over 4 days, over a weekend. And once we made the contracts available, we also made our analysis available. And I think that's an important strategy for civil society. When you're releasing contracts or information that you fought really hard to access, you've got to provide your analysis so that you can also shape the public narrative. And what we found, and it was reported on globally, was bullying and really serious cases of bullying, undermining of democratic practices in South Africa. The terms and conditions of each of the contracts were really to favor pharma. They were really one-sided. There were very high demands around secrecy and confidentiality obligations and also around indemnification. None of the vaccines would be released unless you set up a one-sided indemnification fund, which gave full indemnity to Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson against any and all forms of risk, even including late delivery of supplies. We also found discrepancies in the prices of our companies that said that they were going to charge the Global South, but what was actually included in the contract. The prices we found were inflated, resulting in, really gross cases of abusive profiteering. And then there was very little leverage given to Global South countries against late or non-delivery of supplies. And the most insidious thing we found in these contracts was something related to Johnson & Johnson, which, while the US and India and other countries were imposing export bans, you remember that during COVID, there was this idea that you first vaccinate your own country and then you allow vaccines to leave your country to other places. So the US imposed an export ban, Europe imposed an export ban, India imposed an export ban. But for South Africa, it's quite clear that what Johnson & Johnson did in a very classic case of pharmaceutical bullying was that the demand was put on the table that if you want our vaccines, you will not be allowed to impose an export ban. And so this is relevant because at this time, Johnson & Johnson, celebrated this voluntary license it had signed with Aspen for J&J vaccines. But what was happening was that J&J was deciding where those vaccines that were filled and finished in South Africa would actually be prioritized for. And it was clear when we found out, did this deep dive expose with the New York Times, and we worked with whistleblowers, that contract provision allowed J&J in its own contract with Aspen to divert vaccines that were filled and finished in South Africa to be diverted to Europe first before South Africans could access the vaccine. So there was that kind of language for, if you want state procurement to materialize, then you can't put limitations on our private contract with another party. And that's what we were able to establish. Once we made the analysis public, and if you go to the next slide, a few things happened. The first is that, it followed quite shortly after the New York Times expose about the J&J diverting vaccines out of South Africa to Europe because of the way in which they negotiated the contracts. And they decided then to pause all kind of exports and to prioritize the African markets. I think that the cases and media coverage does have significant impact for access. But at that time already people were using the Pfizer vaccine. So that's a different conversation. But what's critical is that, remember in the beginning I said that we had to sue our government and we were seen as being in opposition to government. But once the contracts were released and government realized that actually what we were after was to talk about the bullying and to talk about the one-sided power of the pharmaceutical industry, government eventually, quickly within 24 hours relented. They surprisingly complied with the court order and within 10 days gave us all the contracts, and then the part 2, the negotiation records were given to us over the next few weeks. So that's why we have 2 different reports. But what's surprising is after defending their conduct in the case, which was we can't make it public, it's secret, we've signed an NDA, there's nothing untoward, how dare you take us to court, etc., they changed tune and basically said, yes, we were bullied. And they conceded that they were screwed, this is their language, in the negotiations, and that they were bullied into signing these contracts and they couldn't believe what they had been asked to do, but they had no choice if they wanted to get vaccines to people in South Africa. And just a few weeks ago, I think Rory's on this call, he also reported that one of our officials was in Geneva recently and said that they, in quote unquote, that they could not believe what they had been asked for. So, like I said, we made the analysis and the contracts public. Government finally conceded. It changed the narrative because then this became all about the conduct and the behavior of the pharmaceutical companies. What's important, and I think this is just on my last point, Adrián, is that you'll remember that in our relief, and if you read our legal papers, we didn't just ask for the final contracts. We were aware that in trying to access vaccines, which were scarce, which were not being prioritized for the global south, that our government was in negotiations with multiple drug companies, not just the 4 that we eventually signed contracts with. Eventually, we only got vaccines from 2, so that's a whole situation. But there were multiple negotiations with companies, even in China, in Russia, various other regions. And we wanted to see what was actually happening in this negotiation phase. So we were very clear in our court papers that we also wanted the negotiation record. We wanted to see the extent to which our government pushed back or did not push back. We wanted to know why did we all of a sudden have a very quickly established indemnification fund? What was happening behind the scenes? And the court said, yes, this is also in the public interest. We're going to make the negotiation records public. And that's actually the subject of the part 2 analysis of the documents. And if you read the negotiation records, that's the more serious and worrying ones for the access to movement going forward. Because one of the things is that they were very clear on the NDAs and they were very clear on insisting on the secrecy secrecy provisions. And I think Rory, again, sorry, I'm singling out Rory, just did an article recently about MSF having been forced, despite what happened with these contracts being made public, the analysis, the scandal that ensued, the story of the bullying, and that NDAs were a problem in this pandemic. the pharmaceutical industry is still insisting on NDAs, even with humanitarian agencies. And that's the subject of the recent article, how MSF was forced into signing an NDA on not even a COVID vaccine, on other drugs. So I think that that sort of, gives you a short summary of why we did the case, how we went through the case, what happened with the case, analyzing the contracts and what we were able to share with the public. And I think the final point on this is that, yes, it was HAI coming forward with the case, but obviously we had to build quite a strong coalition of partners who felt that, yes, this was an important case to do, and that it was relevant for us to try and actually break that secrecy and to try and have a precedent for the next pandemic or the next time a pharmaceutical company tries to bully the South African government into signing a contract with ridiculous terms and conditions, high prices, and NDAs. Thank you.
We don't hear you, Adrián. Yep.
Oh, sorry. I was saying that thank you very much, Fatima, and we will answer any questions that the public has right after Claudia and Jose Daniel's presentation. Please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adrián, and all speakers and attenders. Jose Daniel and me are going to do a dual presentation about the case of COVID-19 vaccine purchases contracts and the issue of prices transparency. First, to do it, we just want to highlight some of the previous ideas behind the chapter, and that was mentioned by Adrián and by Fatima. Transparency is a core principle of the market and is a price regulatory tool itself. But also we want to highlight that at the same time, transparency is a relevant democratic principle. So we should have in mind that the information about medicines prices must be considered by governments and citizens as a public good that works both to prevent abuses and to improve access and strengthen democracy. We are going to do some preliminary remarks on the Colombian case, saying that Colombian government and pharmaceutical companies cooperated to avoid publication of the contracts at the beginning of the pandemic. Colombian government cooperation derived from contractual obligation with pharmaceutical companies. Pharmaceutical companies pressured countries all around Latin America do not disclose their vaccines purchases contracts, threatening that publication would constitute a breach of contract and jeopardize vaccines distributions. On the other hand, citizen oversight of different civil society actors, we were included that our research center, the think tank Medicines, Information and Power, to advocate for transparency. And finally, we want to remark that the role of the judicial system in applying national and international standards to safeguard the right of access to information. Go ahead, Jose Daniel.
Thank you, Claudia. Do you listen to me? Yeah. So we want to make a a brief presentation about the Colombian case, because it's a really complex case in which the Colombian government and pharmaceutical companies fought against the civil society in order to avoid the publication of the vaccine purchase contracts. This case started with an information request for the International Institute for Corruption Studies, which is a civil society actor, to the National Unit for the Management of Disaster, which is a public entity in Colombia, which contract laws are a private law. So the response from this national unity to the civil society actor was that they were not allowed, because they signed the purchase contracts related to the COVID vaccines, but they said that they were not allowed to publish such contracts because there were trade secrets related to the prices of the COVID-19 vaccines, because there were confidentiality clauses in the purchase contracts, and because some of the negotiation parts of this process were there were an obligation of the state to avoid the publication of such negotiations because of national security. So this was the response of the National Unity for Disaster Management, and this was an argument that was said again and again in the entire process of this case. Because of this response to the Institute of Corruption Studies, the International Institute of Corruption Studies, there was an insistent appeal from this institute and from a lawyer, also from the civil society called Ramiro Bejarano. Later, other actors of the social of the civil society were going to join these kind of calls and these discussions. The think tank was one of them, and they filed an insistence appeal to the National Unity for Disaster Management in order to publish such contracts. And there was a first ruling from the Administrative Court of Cundinamarca, which is like the first instance in this kind of cases, ordering the National Unity to submit the contract information to the civil society actors. Here is where our Ministry of Health enters the case and files an incident of nullity in order to cancel this ruling for the Administrative Court of Cundinamarca. And after the intervention of our Ministry of Health, so far we had only the intervention of two actors of the Colombian government. There was an action of protection filed from Janssen Pharmaceutical in the Council of State, which is like the highest court in this matter in Colombia, to suspend the effects of the ruling of the Administrative Court of Cundinamarca. This was the first time pharmaceutical companies entered the case. And just to tell you the action of protection is a constitutional action we have in Colombia in order to protect fundamental rights, which was kind of a unprecedented filing in Colombia from the pharmaceutical companies, because they were saying that fundamental rights were violated, human rights were violated, specifically the due process fundamental right. So the Council of State grants a preliminary injunction to Janssen Pharmaceutica while it studied the lawsuit filed by Janssen Pharmaceutica. The government, after this filing from Janssen Pharmaceutical, started an incident of nullity to the same decision. And then Janssen Pharmaceutica, in addition to the action of protection related to human rights, filed another incident of nullity to the same decision. So as you can see so far, this was kind of a coordinated strategy between the government and the pharmaceutical companies so far in order to avoid the publication of such contracts. We didn't knew at this time which was the reason of this coordination. We later knew, as I'm going to tell you, because the Council of State, after ruling against Janssen Pharmaceutica and reversing the preliminary injunction previously granted, publishes by mistake two of the vaccine contracts signed with AstraZeneca and Pfizer. So this was an administrative mistake. Those contracts were published by mistake at first. But once we read the contracts, and I think it was a similar case to Fatima's, to the case Fatima explained in South Africa, Colombia had the obligation of defend the confidentiality of these contracts. If any actor of the civil society, any actor, any private actor, among others, files a request of information in order to publish such contracts, it was an obligation of the Colombian government to defend such secrecy. So, but this time we already knew what was happening with this strategy that was really coordinated between pharmaceutical companies and our government. There later, AstraZeneca joined in after that publication and filed an incident of nullity, and then there was another action of protection with the same ground from Ministry of Health at the National Unity of Disaster Management, filed in the Council of State to suspend the effects of the ruling of the Administrative Court of Cundinamarca. So we had already like 6 or 7 actions filed against this ruling of the Administrative Court of Cundinamarca, both from our Colombian government and from pharmaceutical companies. The Council of State grants another preliminary injunction to the Ministry of Health and this national unit, but finally, it rules against the Ministry of Health and the National Unity for Disaster Management and reverses again for the second time a preliminary injunction ruling. There were challenges against this decision, both from the Minister of Health and from the National Unity for the management, the disaster management, sorry. But in the end, I think it was in the first months of 2022, there was 2022, there was a final decision from the Council of State against the Colombian government and the pharmaceutical companies, but especially the Colombian government, and it ruled in favor of publishing these contracts signed between the pharmaceutical companies and the Colombian government. The arguments the Council of State stated were related to the absence of a trade secret related to the prices of the vaccines. They said there are no such trade secrets related to such prices, to those prices. They also study and bring to account some international treaties related to human right protection, and especially the principle of transparency. So it is a really important ruling, this Council of State final ruling, for us in Colombia, because it sends up an important precedent in future negotiations of this kind in this kind of emergency situations related to the purchasing of vaccines and other pharmaceutical products. So this was like the brief, sorry if I extended, the brief summary of our case in Colombia. Claudia.
Thank you, Jose Daniel. The line that you presented and we wrote in that chapter showed how the narrative used by the company was the same all around the world. And even the publication that was a sweet mistake, we also permit or also do a way to remark some lesson learned from this case, from the Colombian case. The first one is the importance of strategic litigation by civil society. Citizen oversight as a good instrument for cooperation. The second lesson, I think, is the importance of civil society's influence on media narratives. This influence should be promoted all the time. And the third one is the importance of regional and global articulation in strategic litigation. Many of the norms applied by courts in Colombia are international norms on the protection of the right to access to information. So let us close our presentation with this this link of a document we produce and shared in networks and media about the case, and that was published with Oxfam, Medicines du Monde, and People's Vaccine in Latin America.
Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia, and thank you, Jose Daniel, for your presentation. I'll try to be very brief, and to do that, I'll skip actually the part where I was planning to discuss the work of Noah Sano in strategic litigation, and the reason is not because we are running out of time, and we're running out of time, but also because many of the things that I was going to say have been already said by other colleagues. So jumping into the discussion, we aimed, as I said, to analyze the barriers and enabling factors that allow civil society organizations to work on strategic litigation. And so we basically mapped 3 different layers of factors that sort of create an equilibrium between what civil society organizations want, which is systemic change, create transparency by design, improved accountability, evaluation, and governance, and treat drug pricing as a global public good, and entrenchment and status quo, basically opacity by design, reduce accountability and evaluation, and poor governance. What we saw are 3 layers. The first one related to the legal frameworks and processes. The second one related to the actors that are active in the system, and those barriers and enabling factors that affect directly civil society organizations. Starting with the most difficult one, the more upstream one, civil society organizations have to rely on freedom of information requests to access pricing information, because opacity is built by design. So if we didn't have that barrier in the first moment, then we wouldn't be here, and we would have access to information from the very early beginning. Because we have to work within this system. All 3 case studies portray as barriers the length, the complexity, and the resources that are needed to implement these cases. So it's a matter of money, because going to court needs money, it needs legal expertise, it needs time, and time to analyze the results of the work. On the right side, the existence of pro-transparency regulation, freedom of information requests, and governance mechanisms like the Transparency Council in Spain or similar bodies in other countries allow civil society to make use of transparency regulations to access this data, which is obviously an enabling factor. When it comes to the actors, I'll break this into, I think it's 3 blocks. First one, the judiciary, and I think Fatima made a comment of the decision by the court being made by an angry court, and I think this is very important. Actors can be both facilitators and act as barriers. In the case of judiciary power, we've seen in Spain how they behave as both as well, as in the case of Colombia and South Africa. When they act as an enabler, they do it with ears more open to pro-transparency claims. And this depends on the political scenario, like a pandemic and a situation of vaccine hoarding. The level of the judiciary, and in Spain, we've seen that first instance courts and the Transparency Council are more prone to pro-transparency claims than higher instance courts, like the National Court, for instance. And in all the cases where federal court decisions have recognized our claims, they've done it recognizing transparency as a democratic principle. Increased funding is very important, and I wanted to bring this up because, as I said before, these actions, they need money and need resources. And we are working in a space in which funding is dwindling, not just in transparency, but in other areas. And global health actors, global health funders don't seem to find this area very attractive to fund. And without this, organizations cannot mobilize the resources necessary to operate, basically. Changes in government's position have also come as a recurring theme in the interviews that we held. Most government positions are reactive against transparency, at least at the very beginning. As we saw in the South African case, we see that can change when the conditions set by companies are too strict, and basically, or in the case of Spain, when there's a change in the Ministry of Health, we've seen also changes to the perception of pro-transparency claims. Greater media attention. I'm very happy also that I see some journalists in the list of participants. Has been very relevant to make our claims more effective. When you are in a political scenario where transparency claims are more likely to be heard by journalists, this allows us to make more changes in the government's position, turn interested or unfavorable judiciary into a more favorable position. And so media attention and public attention is very relevant. And finally, those barriers and enabling factors relevant to civil society. I mentioned lack of funding, capacity to have human resources and technical expertise, or capacity to actually do these things. Salud por Derecho and Hassan, the coalition of civil society groups that have been working in Spain, we've been working on many of these cases for almost 5 years now. So this takes a lot of time and resources and money to go to court. So the way civil society groups have addressed this barrier is basically something that my colleagues have already said, which is acting through networks. International and national networks of civil society allow us to basically touch on the expertise that other organizations have and bring our expertise closer to other organizations, which makes things much easier to basically operate in this space. I wanted to mention very briefly one theme, which is corporate power, and this has been mentioned by all interviewees many times. Corporate power obviously influences transparency directly and strategic litigation when they have big lawyer or legal departments to lengthen the processes and make it more resource intensive, because they have the capacity to basically go to court or to defend their position, and basically entrench opacity built in by design in the system. At the same time, there's more nuanced ways in which corporate power operates. The first one, or the most important one, is basically on capacity to create narratives. Narratives that increase transparency might increase drug prices, that it might deter innovation, that it might make pharmaceutical companies pull their investments out of a country. And we've seen several cases, for example, in Europe very recently, on this matter. And this is very relevant because it acts before civil society works in strategic litigation, creating governmental resistance, unfavorable judiciary, and lower or more critical media attention, or more aligned to the interests of pharma, which basically strengthens the entrenchment of pharmaceutical companies and corporate power in the system. And very briefly, just to summarize the way, because power is everywhere and civil society actors have been able to mobilize certain type of resources to overcome these barriers. Civil society groups use their networks basically as a source of power, not just because that allows them to use different resources that are not necessarily available to the individual organizations, but also because it allows them to use their moral power, sort of speaking, to create more media attention or attract media attention and public interest, to make changes in the government's position. And I think Fatima, for instance, made a very good point when they highlighted the completely unfair conditions that pharmaceutical companies have imposed to the country, then that made creative changes in the government's position or in the judiciary. I wanted to finish with one figure, which is the figure of the visiting bureaucrats, and I owe this figure or this name to my colleague and friend Tatiana Andia. And visiting bureaucrats are basically those figures that are very aligned with civil society or that operate within the civil society movement, such as Claudia, for example, and then they move to the administration. And these actors are very important also because they allow civil society to be connected with the government, but also because they can create the enabling factors for more pro-transparency regulation and governance mechanisms to be set up. And just in the interest of time, considering that we're at the end of the presentation, I'll stop here and leave it open for the people to ask questions if they have any. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Adrián. Thanks a lot to all the presenters. We are now opening these last minutes. We'll spend a little bit if there are questions. So please feel free to. Well, first question is there. So please open your mic, or maybe we have to open their mics. No, I think they can open their mics, right, Adrián? Go ahead, Ipek. Please go ahead. Your mic is muted, so you might need to open it. Okay, so we will hold on that one until the person is able to figure out the mic situation. Please, the other participants, feel free to raise your hand or type in the chat.
Okay.
Now it's open.
Okay, so I'd like to thank all the presenters. I congratulate them for all their efforts. It's very inspiring and very hopeful. Congratulations, Fatima and Claudia. And Adrián, thank you for your very nice and elaborate descriptive scheme. It's really very useful. But I think this is just a comment on everything that you have been saying. I think we also have to, Adrián's scheme just lays out all the different features of the struggle across different contexts, but I think that it does not provide much of the causal power processes that result in these outcomes. So I think as a whole, we should be thinking about different causal power processes that results in all these outcomes. For example, why do we have favorable justice system and unfavorable justice system? Why we have resources in certain contexts and we don't have them in other contexts. So I think it is important to think about these causal processes, and while we think about these causal processes, it's important to have some conception of what the state does and what social classes do, in addition to the corporate power conceptualization that we already have. So the only form of power figure there was corporate power that I could see, but I think we should really unlock state as a form of class power and explain why under certain circumstances the state institutions function the way they function differentially in different situations. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot to you. Any of the presenters want to comment on this insightful intervention?
Just want to say that the power and the political changes, the democratic dynamic that each state live is part of this, systemic change. Sometimes even if we have a strong judiciary institutions and great civil society organizations, sometimes the changes on political government changes from the political point of view, I think could be the major factor or driver that could play in a way of transparency or in a way of opacity. So what I'm completely sure is that if we have some links between academic journalism and I think even the mobilization of society, we can, be a balance to try to move ahead the transparency idea, the transparency principle in the pharmaceutical ecosystem, in the health system, and of course in the democracy. But I don't know if Adrián or other Fatima or José Daniel want to say another thing. Something.
Thanks, Claudia, and I think great comment. In fact, I just want to mention a few things. At the same time that the South African government was being bullied into signing these secrecy clauses and NDAs and the contracts and the inflated prices and all the terms and conditions that were really one-sided, the same government was sitting in Geneva arguing for the TRIPS waiver and being really bold in its leadership. So there was a disconnect because our government at home was acting as if it had no power with these pharmaceutical companies and just agreeing to anything they asked for. So much so that they set up an indemnification fund over a weekend with no public comment through a parliamentary process. So it was very schizophrenic for us because we were saying, on the one hand, you're showing this amazing global leadership asking for, relaxation of IP rules and taking on this industry and talking about vaccine apartheid. But at home, you're signing these contracts and just sort of acting as if you have no power under our constitution. Our government was at fault for being bullied. I mean, they now will complain that they were being bullied and they can't believe it, but they could have issued compulsory licenses. They could have said, no, our constitution doesn't allow this. We refuse to sign these contracts. They didn't have to agree on the no ban provision. I mean, some of the provisions maybe, but there was some that were so egregious that, it's amazing that all of those people are still working in government and are now just turning around and saying, oh, well, thank you for opening the contracts. Yes, we were bullied. We can't believe that this has happened, because the same thing is going to happen again unless they put in the correct relevant frameworks. So I think it's too easy for our government to turn around and say, yes, we were bullied and thank you, HII, for going to open up the contracts. I mean, why did you agree to this in the first place? Why did you defend the case? And I think that goes to the other issue about who owns the power in a pandemic. Why did you come to court and defend the case and waste our time and refuse to give us the information in the beginning? I mean, this needlessly took, 12 to 18 months. It should have been much sooner. So I'm worried that our governments are now going to use this as precedent to give the pharmaceutical industry whatever it wants in any negotiations going forward, and then civil society will come and ask for the contracts, and then they'll say, yes, we were bullied by pharma. It's a very convenient thing for a government that's elected, that has all these resources available to them, that they can't out-negotiate the CEO of a pharmaceutical industry and its lawyers. I think that's what we should be worrying about, because the trend is towards more demanding of NDAs, more demands around secrecy clauses. I mean, if MSF can't withstand the bullying, then I really worry about how all of us are going to do this. So I think, Claudia, I think IPAC, I think everybody's correct, is how do we do two things? One is make sure our governments are never bullied again in this way, right? And then at the same time, make sure that pharma doesn't get away literally with what they have in COVID and going forward, where they're making unreasonable demands. And I think the irony here is, when we were arguing for the TIPS waiver and all of these contracts were secret, and in Latin America, they were asking for state assets as surety. That was the only thing our government pushed back on, because our parliament said we're not giving up state assets as surety. But that was the only thing that they were able to push back on, because they had seen and had heard what was happening in Latin America. And so I think Adrian's point and Hami's point about the role of the media is so important, because if there was no reporting on what was happening in Latin America, we would not have known that we needed to push back in South Africa on the state assets, the surety required.
I agree with everything that is being said. Fatima, thank you very much for the comment. And that is precisely what I'm referring to, like the proactive South African role in the international negotiations and like much passive role at home. This is exactly why I'm saying that we have to unwrap what we consider as state power. Precisely as you said, perhaps it's not the same government. Maybe there are different locations, locuses of power within the state itself. Maybe state itself is not homogeneous. It's a capitalist state, but it doesn't mean that it's going to exclude the public interest in its entirety. So what I was suggesting was maybe we should like problematize the state power alongside with the corporate power and find locuses of power within the state institution itself, for example, as in the case of that particular court, that is more favorable, that so-called crystallizes the public interests more compared with other institutions. This is what I wanted to suggest. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And I am very conscious of the time. So if there is any other pressing comment or question, please go ahead. And if not, we will make a conclusion round for the panelists for the intervention. So please raise your hand if so. And if not, of course, it's open, whatever you want to say to conclude the conversation. But I will throw a question to you all. In the context where, as Fatima has said, transparency is being contested widely, I would like to finalize the conversation with a sort of call to action in the sense of what international policy opportunities or spaces do you envisage for a push to transparency globally? You have mentioned some ideas, Fatima, about how to prevent our national governments not to be bullied, and also how to make pharma not to make unjustified claims. But how do you see that, especially since we are focusing these sessions for civil society? What spaces do we have for action to empower ourselves? So maybe we do in the same order as we started. Fatima, if you want, please go ahead.
I think just briefly, I can't believe that after everything that happened in COVID, we have a situation where Bayer has forced MSF to sign an NDA. So it means that something is not working in the way in which we thought our litigation would have the necessary results. So it almost seems as if pharmaceutical companies don't care, and it doesn't really matter to them whether they get bad publicity, they won the NDA. So I think the way in which we have to respond is twofold. The one is, massive campaigning and litigation against pharmaceutical industry. But I think the way in which it's something that we talked about after COVID is that all UN contracts, all global fund contracts are now perhaps cut and decimated. But wherever the site of the major procurement is for key medicines or key life-threatening illnesses that are happening at a global level, that's where we have to push those boards to ensure that there isn't an NDA. You know, our litigation was also asking for the COVAX contracts. We also sued them. So there's multiple mechanisms that have been set up as so-called not-for-profit bodies or institutions, but they are procuring for people in the global south, but there's no transparency on those contracts. And I think we can start with the demand on that. And then obviously to be very carefully monitoring what happens at a local level or regional level, where the African Union, for example, is now deciding to procure different medicines or vaccines for different diseases. We have to insist that those are transparent and that they don't, they don't include NDAs and secret clauses. I still think there's a piece of work flowing from the COVID contracts where, for example, I think Politico asked Johnson & Johnson last week about our contracts from COVID and the prices. And these companies are still maintaining that what's in the contracts is not what they did, that they didn't charge a higher price, that they charge a not-for-profit price, but they're refusing to make statements of account publicly available. And so I still think there's still work to be done on continuing the COVID work for transparency and still putting the naming and shaming public pressure campaigns on these companies to say, well, if you claim something, then you've got to show us the evidence of that. You know, it's one thing to say we charge you the same price as all low-income countries. Show us the statement of account. Where are the refunds? Because why did you include a price in the contract if you're now saying that you charge a different price? So I think that's sort of where our work's going to be. I'm not naive to think that there's not going to be a pushback. We're seeing already the pushback for transparency in even the pandemic negotiations. So I think we're up against quite a difficult industry and quite a difficult struggle. But yeah, we've got to do the work to shine the light in. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Fatima. Claudia, Jose Daniel, please go ahead if you have any comments.
Just to say, we are in the middle of the Sisyphus history, Roman or I don't know, Greek history. We should put up a big stone, and then the stone coming down, and we should put again and again and again, and being strong to do it. It should be the message. We are always, or should be, must be, open and able to push up the big rock, the big stone, to the top of the hill, even the stone is coming back.
Yeah, I agree with Claudia, and I also wanted to make a small comment regarding, I mean, in these cases we were putting out a fire of secrecy, but there is a big state power and government power related to how the research and development of these vaccines is funded. So maybe if we go 2 or 3 steps back and we rethink the way we fund this research and development, and in the case of COVID, a lot of vaccines were massively funded by public resources. We may put out some conditions related to how those public resources are used and how the products that come out of that research and development process are produced and bring to the different countries around the world. So I think there is a big state power related to how do we rethink the research and development process related to these vaccines and other medicines.
Thanks, Adrián. Last intervention.
Yeah, thanks. I don't know. I'm not very good at making future projections. I'm usually wrong. So speaking as a European and seeing what's going on, the policy space in Europe, we are seeing more secrecy laws being implemented in with regards to pharmaceuticals in Germany and Switzerland. We are seeing a decrease of funding to global health institutions. So from the global north perspective, things are not looking great. But to not end up with a, and I would say that also going back to the power thing, I think the narrative capacity or the capacity to create narratives from the pharmaceutical industry that feed on this fear that it's emerging in the global north of, securitizing the state rather than ensuring the security of human beings, promoting lack of transparency and lack of regulation in the pharmaceutical sector in order to protect the industry. I think that's been very powerful in the last few months, at least. And that's a challenge that we need to address globally. And on a more positive note, one thing that amazes me from the interviews and from the discussions that I've had with the other panelists and other people that are in the call as well, is the capacity of very, very, very small civil society groups to collaborate with each other and draw on a huge amount of skills and resources that we have at our disposal. So I do believe that, in order to keep pushing that rock, and I hope that this transparency battle doesn't become a Sisyphus myth of, keep pushing the rock uphill endlessly, that we should be an example of not overprotecting the state and, keep thinking that protecting the state means protecting the people and go beyond those borders to ensure that justice is, universal. It's not something that gets in framed by the boundaries of the state. And I think, some of the things that the panelists have been doing, working with other people internationally and nationally, it's a great example of that. So I really hope that in the future we can see more of this collaboration, not only within civil society, but also with more, state-state collaboration. And I'll leave with that.
So thanks a lot for these remarking comments that I'm gonna summarize in 10 seconds and then close the session. So we are in a Sisyphus dilemma, as Claudia put it, with the rock going down the hill and the Titan has to put it up, but that's gonna be the struggle for the following months and years as we are seeing it. One of the recommendations that Fatima has put into the table is to push against NDA for all major procurers of life-threatening diseases, the medication for the life-threatening diseases, but not only these global health initiatives, but also regional level. That's meaning the African Union, that also means HERA, that also means revolving fund in the America region. Also, she made the point of asking the pharma to show the evidence. So it's a bit of show me the evidence call. And this is a very important narrative. We have been seeing that. We have seen that in the sentences by the National Court in Spain, where no evidence was used by the court to support the claims by the industry, while we presented a lot of evidence. So show me the evidence. That's Fatima's recommendation. From our Colombian colleagues, go a few steps back and look to the way we fund R&D. We need to counter the narrative upstream. So that means who funds the R&D, but also what resources do we use for R&D? If clinical trials are conducted within our communities and with our public infrastructure, that's also publicly funded and community supported. So let's see at new narratives and new ways to count for the R&D. We are also seeing less transparency, especially in the global north, with setbacks in the EU, but also to global health initiatives. But we have to reinforce the capacity to create narratives, not only regarding transparency, but new threats such as security, industrial protection, and so on. And we definitely have to keep working on the way we connect as civil society, but also how we make different states to connect with potential allies across regions. So maybe it's not only that Spain has to collaborate with potential EU members, but maybe Spain has to look outside and start collaborating with members in Latin America or in the African continent. And of course, reinforce these spaces, such as the one we are today, but also the spaces that Fatima has explained for analysis and so on, as a very particular and powerful tool for bringing resources together, the importance of connection. And we can advance that these series are going to move forward throughout the year, and we will be discussing other topics from clinical trial and transparency around the world, not only cost, but also results and policy developments and how we can learn from different regions in order to promote the agenda forward. So thanks a lot to Claudia, Fatima, Jose Daniel, Adrián, to all the people in the chat for all the comments, and please feel free to reach out any of the presenters and ourselves if you have any further questions or comments on this topic. Thanks a lot and see you soon.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Muchas gracias.